Hello, chess fans. Today's game is my number 8 best game of the 2000s, Timofeev versus Khismatullin. I'm particularly excited to show this game because I think many of you might not have seen it, and I had not seen it prior to preparing for this series. I previously called a beautiful game won by the young Azerbaijani prodigy Suleimanli the Immortal Space Invaders game, but I now think that this game truly deserves that title, and you'll soon see why. Timofeev opens up the game with pawn to e4, and even though we get a Sicilian from Khismatullin, the game is not going to be one of fireworks. In fact, I'm going to blitz straight through the first 40 moves of this game here so we can get to some really critical decisions later on. This is a total positional massage and maneuvering game for that first 40 moves. The key here is that white is going to play after pawn c4, d4, and we're going to get an exchange here that leads to the Moroxi bind. The Moroxi bind is when white establishes a pawn on e4 and a pawn on c4. It gives white a space advantage, but also when you take up space, you do accept responsibility for that space. You have a lot of squares you have to cover here. You have to watch pawn breaks like b5 and d5. In general, this is good for a slight plus for white, but it's very, very slight, and Khismatullin shouldn't have too much to worry about out of the opening. So both players play sensible and natural moves from here. There's not a lot of danger and tricks to be mentioned here. I think that in the long run, white has more pawn breaks available, which is why this is slightly more favorable for white. Probably all of the pawn breaks that white can play for can be contained, but you'd rather be the one toying with the idea of maybe I'll make a pawn break and get some kind of initiative than be the one going, how am I going to contain these pawn breaks and make sure that my opponent doesn't get some kind of initiative? So after queen c5, one interesting thing here is that the computer does like, and this is maybe one of the few opportunities the computer thinks there is early in the game, is taking on c5 when after knight takes c5, b4, white grabs a lot of space. But I think the computer's overestimating this position. I think it's much closer to equality. This pawn on c4 is a little bit weak. Yes, you can come up here and it looks really active, but black can play a little bit passively for a moment, hold everything together, and it's really not clear how white is to make progress. The weakness on c4 is a bit of an issue, so Timofeev does reject this and keep maneuvering and keep his c4 pawn secure by not pushing his b pawn. The queens leave the board, b3 has to be defended, a5 gives up any idea of b5, which really wasn't going to be achievable anyway, but black is saying, I'm just totally locking down your pawn breaks and I'll just draw the game. And white's going to keep maneuvering and keep saying, I have more space and maybe I can find a breakthrough at some point. At least I'm going to see if you demonstrate the kind of technique needed to hold everything together here. So black is sitting here and just sitting, waiting for white to do something. And it's going to only be just before the 40th move or on the 40th move that white tries to do something here. And that's right here. And I think this is key. I think white, even though I don't know the time control for this game or the time situation for this game, I think white's timing things so that right here on the 40th move, we can create a really difficult decision for black when black is going to have the minimum amount of time possible to make that decision before getting more time after move 40. It's very typical if you're not familiar with that. A lot of classical tournaments are played where you have a certain amount of time to complete 40 moves. You get there, you get more time. So often an important part of the gamesmanship is creating a difficult decision for your opponent just before they get that additional time. That is what white does here. Pause your video if you want to try and figure out the positional decision that white decided on here. So the brilliant move in this position is rook to b5. Boom! This is a thunderous, thunderous positional move. White, with a reduced amount of material in the endgame, is offering up a rook on b5 to that knight on c7. It's a thoroughly positional exchange sacrifice, and it's a very, very strong one. Now, before we look at accepting the sacrifice, which is what happens in the game, I want to point out some of the options available to black instead. Black could have played very passively by pulling up and defending here. There's no other choice that doesn't involve capturing on b5 because there's so much pressure on the b file. But in this position, very strong is the move pawn to b4, just squeezing this position here. If you capture on b4, then just king takes b4. And again, at some point, you're going to capture here, but it's only getting worse for you because this rook is going to be totally trapped and captured here by pushing a5. So defending passively in that way is not resolving your problem. So you need to capture on b5, which black does. After rook b5, you could capture with the rook, declining the sacrifice, but saying, okay, I don't need to accept your sacrifice material. I don't want to get my rook trapped on b6. This should just be a draw, right? Unfortunately, it's not just a draw, although this still might be the best way for black to play. After c takes b5, white will get some initiative here by pushing the pawn to b4. And there's a queenside majority for white that is a bit mobile. There's some initiative here. Black's pawns can't really get rolling. Is it enough to win the game for white? I'm really not sure, but white is the only one who can win the game, and there are decent chances, and certainly the opportunity is there to press for a long time. This is the kind of position grandmasters certainly love to massage and try and get that full point from. So instead, we do see knight takes b5, accepting the sacrificed rook here. Now, white's going to capture back with the a pawn. This is the strong way to capture back here because, among other things, this a pawn is going to be weak now that we've exposed it here. And now the whole point of this exchange sacrifice is that this rook here on b6 is trapped. It is dead. We've sacrificed an exchange, but in no way is the knight on f5 at all inferior to that rook on b6. Now, black may be able to get that rook out of b6, but that's only going to come at the cost of at least a pawn sacrificed by pushing the pawn forward to d5 to free up room to run. And then white's going to still have very, very strong pieces, and black's rooks are still going to be suppressed. So from this position, we see king to e8, and now white, I think, did miss a strong continuation that might have finished off the game more quickly, but white is better no matter what. That strong continuation was king b2, thinking about pulling the king around this way. When the a pawn can end up very vulnerable, you can maneuver the knight around to maybe win it, and the knight also is thinking about going over here and trapping this rook. For example, let's say black plays some natural moves. At some point, we're going to have a possibility of playing pawn to c5, trapping and winning this rook on the spot right here. Now, this works because we have a pin on the d file, but even if black realizes that this is an issue and avoids putting the king here on the d file, it doesn't necessarily stop the idea, because in this position, c5 still works. It's even more beautiful this way, of course, because after this pawn sacrifice, the rook is trapped here on b6. Very, very beautiful stuff from white. So that might have been a more immediate and decisive continuation. Swing the king around here and mix that with ideas of c5 and the knight coming around. Very, very strong option. Now, Timofeev is going to play a little less directly, but still he's in total control right here. So we get rook to a1, we get pawn to e6, pushing that knight back, that knight pulls back, and d5, saying, I just cannot let my rook stay here anymore. Things are only going to get worse. I must free the rook. So white captures here on d5, the rook swings over, and now pawn to c5, pushing that rook back. White has many good choices here, and maybe it's mostly a matter of taste. For example, you can take on e6, because this pawn can't easily be won. If you go for it, rook e1 is strong, and then the knight can give a discovered check, and it's getting to d6 or b6 and winning either b7 or an exchange. So that's really, really strong. Also, just pawn d6 was strong. Here, black might try rook ac8, hoping to put pressure on this, but you can just play pawn to b4, defending everything and maintaining a huge mass of pawns in the middle of the board. So, In the game, white didn't choose to take or move. White just left this pawn here and played king d4, saying, hey, you can take here, but my knight will be amazing and I'll still be much better here, which is absolutely true. Is this position winning for white? I'm not sure, but certainly white is better despite being the exchange down. Instead, though, black decides to use tactics here. Black plays rook ac8, allowing white to capture on a5, which white does. e5 check now, pushing the king back here. If you fall back king d3, you're just dropping c5, right? So you must defend c5 with king here, and now pawn to b6. This was black's point in sacrificing that a5 pawn. Now, what would you play here as white? I really encourage you to pause your video and decide on the strongest continuation. So what white decided on, and there are multiple good decisions here, but I think the best ones involve sacrificing the rook. What white decided on was the sacrifice pawn b4. Boom. You're giving up the rook in an endgame for a massive four connected passed pawns. Now you know why I call this the Space Invaders game. These 4 space invading pawns right here are just going to creep up the board one square at a time, and those 2 black rooks and that king are going to be totally helpless to stop these pawns. So in this position, I do want to mention that other good options existed. If you decided on pawn c6, saying, I don't need 4 connected passed pawns, I just need these 3 connected passed pawns, that was also a good decision. This was also very, very strong. And also rook a6 is good here, but I definitely think rook a6 is inferior to sacrificing the rook. Either b4 or pawn c6, sacrificing the rook for 3 or 4 connected passed pawns is, in my opinion, the way to go, both objectively and practically. So in the game, b4, and this is accepted. I just want to pause here and say that I think the stockfish evaluation is irrelevant. Now, the stockfish evaluation is still in white's favor, but don't worry about whether this is +1, +2, +3, anything like that. You should just look at this position, look at these monstrous pawns right here, and go, yeah, you're not stopping these pawns. These pawns are absolutely going to queen. The rest of the moves are for black pure torture. You're struggling here, but you are totally helpless against the advancing pawns. So the way that black chose to struggle was rook a8, pawn to a6, e4, offering a pawn here to hope to get some counterplay on the e file, but it's never going to be in time. King d7, the knight swings over, getting ready to push with pawn c6 check, which now comes. King d8, and then there's lots and lots of good choices here. For example, king c5, you can give this up here and just keep pushing your pawns, but instead knight d6 is really nice, defending and also attacking that rook, so that rook moves up here. Rook to e7, and now king c5, so much control. Pawn to f5, sacrificing to activate the rook here, but we're just going to take that. Your rook can have that activity on the second rank. It's no never mind to me. Knight b7 check, king e8, pawn to d6 here, right? The space invading pawns reach one square closer right here. Rook takes g2. If you had more time, you could queen here in 4 moves, but you don't have 4 moves. d7 check, king e7, and we actually have a 5th space invading pawn over here to push. f6 check, distracting the king so that after pawn c7 with connected passers on the 7th rank here, d8 queen will come with check, and there's absolutely no defending it. So black resigned in this position. An amazing game. If you can think of any other games featuring 4 connected passed pawns, I want to see them. It's like my new favorite thing. So I hope you enjoyed this Immortal Space Invaders game. If you want to see the other games that rank in my top 10 of the 2000s, you can click on the playlist that's sitting right on top of the board. And as always, if you want to subscribe to the channel to be notified of future videos, it would be thoroughly appreciated.